All right, it's Wednesday again, and it is March 31st, 3/31, 2021, the very last day of the quarter, last day of March. Tomorrow's April Fool's Day. Markets closed Friday for Good Friday, and it's Easter weekend, and so a lot going on, I guess. Yeah, it's been a weird market in keeping tradition with last week and previous weeks, where you have certain stocks that are doing well and certain stocks that have been hammered, and then you have this rotation and it's almost like a day-to-day type of rotation where some days like today, all of a sudden the tech stocks and the former high flyers, many of which have been hit hard, are bouncing back. And let's see, today at 4:20, I believe Biden is going to announce an couple $1 trillion infrastructure bill, which everybody's known about. But we're getting a little bit of a market rally this morning based on that. And man, there's been a lot of stuff that's gone on obviously since last week, and we did have another stock trigger in. There hasn't been a whole lot to choose from as far as the system goes. There hasn't been a whole lot of new stocks hit the pending. There's been a couple. We'll take a look at the pending list. I believe a couple have dropped off, and it's just sort of the market itself is in limbo. Even with the Dow at a new all-time high, the market itself is kind of still in limbo. Let's look at the Qs here and see where they're at. Oh, that's interesting. This morning we're pushed right up against this trend line that I drew at some point. I can't remember if I had this trend line on the show last week or not, but kind of interesting. I was talking about like the little quadrants and the resistance and all that in the Qs. So anyway, um, Qs are rallying today. The Nasdaq's pretty strong here today, but as you can see in the bigger scheme of things, it's just now starting to kind of poke above this trend line, and there's a couple of prior highs just above here from the past couple of weeks here. So it's got a lot of work to do, obviously, to climb back up. And then of course there's this overhead resistance here. So yeah, Nasdaq, while it's actually having a pretty good little rally here this week so far. But as you can see, there's a lot of work to be done to get all the way back to the highs. Whereas the Dow itself is basically maintaining this rally from back at the beginning of the month there. Back at the beginning of the month, the Dow basically ran up here while the tech stocks were weak, and then there was a little tiny dip here for a few days, and then it's basically sitting right up at the highs here. Okay, so I guess yesterday, it was the day before, it was Monday that it closed at an all-time high. And then of course you got the good old S&P, which is what I refer to as the market, and at this trend line, actually this particular trend line on a candlestick chart looks pretty good. Yeah, it's maybe like anything, a trend line is sort of an approximation. But I mean, hey, obviously the trend is up. And I was talking back here about how when it gets extended from this trend line, it tends to revert to it, right? And so, I mean, back here it was just basically kind of climbing up, but you had this first sort of pull back to the trend line, and then another bounce, another new high, pull back, and then just right back here, mid-March, you had rally to new highs, pull back to the trend line. So anyway, the trend is still up, and I've been saying for a long time, as long as this trend line is intact, and no matter how you want to draw it, basically the market is obviously in an uptrend, and and it's tough to it's tough to want to bet against the market when it's right up at the all-time highs. But then again, you look at the Qs and you think, well, and a lot of stocks. I mean, there's a lot of stocks out there. Let's look at just a couple here. I wanted to look at Apple because, well, I just saw it go by on the ticker because it's Apple's been like the bellwether stock, right? There's a lot of times where there was a lot of times last year where the big FANG stocks, FAAMANG, Facebook and Apple and Microsoft and Google and all that stuff. But they were basically driving the market up while the internals were kind of weak, and so it's really interesting to see the S&P at a high with Apple. Yeah, I mean, it's not that far off the highs, but it is. I mean, it's well off the highs, and it obviously has a lot of work to do to get back to the highs. Um, Tesla, which got added to the S&P, is down fairly significantly from the high. Went from 900 to 550. 600 is like sort of the over and under in Tesla. You can see that we had a little trade here that hit the stop in Tesla. It hasn't shown back up on the pending list yet. The setup's not right, but it could come back. So yeah, and so let's see. Facebook. Let's look at Facebook. Facebook is really close to the highs, so it's hanging in there pretty well. Google. Google right up at the highs. It's funny. I believe this was the last earnings for Google, and then it's kind of just been trading this little tight. This is a tight range for Google, really. Very tight range considering. But, it traded in pretty tight range for months right here and then broke out to a new level. And so that's a pretty constructive chart. If you didn't know what that was, the ticker symbol, anything like that, I would say that that's a that's a pretty darn constructive chart if it breaks out to the upside here. So, and then of course, you got to throw Microsoft in there. Got to throw Microsoft in, which is a little bit of a dip back over here, but it's sort of been trending sideways as well. So, some of these big cap stocks, and of course, all of those are constituents of the Nasdaq 100. So it's kind of interesting to see, the Nasdaq has a lot of work to do. I mentioned this at some point, maybe it was a few weeks ago, that back during the dot-com bust in 2000, the Nasdaq got hammered and the Dow would be up, right? I mean, that was kind of one of the themes from back then that I do remember is that the Nasdaq and the Dow would literally, like, on a day-to-day basis trade opposite of each other, depending on where the hot money thought that what the market was going to do. And so, I mean, obviously, the 2000 dot-com bust took them both down, but the Nasdaq, I mean, really, really gave it all back, whereas the Dow was a little more resilient. So anyway, I mean, there's a lot going on. The reopening trade, and there are a lot of really conflicting type of information out there, right? The Fed says there's no inflation, but everybody knows that. Well, I think it was home prices were up 11% year over year, right? And I think I saw this morning that a whole bunch of food companies are announcing price increases because commodity prices are up and all that. So it's an interesting world out there as far as the markets go. But I'm looking at my watch list here. There's a whole bunch of stocks that are rebounding significantly today. This ARK ETF, and I'm sure you've heard of the ARK ETFs or whatever, is kind of, I'm not going to say it's a bellwether for like the momentum and high tech stuff, but it is kind of. It's kind of one of these things where, this fund is attracted billions of dollars because of its obviously tremendous performance, since the March lows. Actually, the lows, um, yeah, I guess it was like last week or whatever, was the 1 year anniversary of the pandemic lows in the market. And of course, the Fed has created trillions of dollars basically to compensate for the pandemic, and that money has found its way into financial assets. Big surprise. And home prices. Well, I guess what you could almost call homes financial assets. Anyway, this ARK ETF's kind of interesting, extremely volatile. They got a few other ones. I think yesterday they came out with a space exploration ETF, so that's kind of interesting. But anyway, interesting market as usual, and it's a lot of fun to watch. And there's a lot of it's like a minefield, right? The wrong stock at the wrong time. I remember what was it? This Teladoc. Boy, this was a favorite, like a pandemic favorite. And there's a lot of stocks like this that have sort of made round trips, right? They had like these tremendous rallies out of nowhere, and then they've come back down. A lot of the EV stocks, electric vehicle stocks, have done the same thing. But we had that one, this Ballard Power, or whatever. This is a pretty good example, basically, of what a lot of thematic story stocks do, right? They go ballistic, and then they come back down, and then so you got a stock that doubles and then loses half its value, and then you look at it and you're like, well, geez, which is the next move? um, Obviously electric vehicles are the future, right? I mentioned this a few weeks ago. A lot of countries in Europe have mandated that all new vehicles are going to have to be electric by a certain year. So there's going to be a there's going to be a big move in there. Oh, you got some. Let's look at these pot stocks. Huh. Hey, look at this craziness. A lot of craziness in the pot stocks. I believe New York City. Is it New York City or New York State legalizing marijuana? So this is actually, this kind of throws everything off. I don't even remember what that was about, but this is actually a really nice looking technical pattern here. I love these kind of little technical patterns. Now this, for whatever reason, this is not an actual pick by the system, but I just happened to notice this little pattern here, and I don't know if it's this craziness right here that is making this pattern look so good, or but I mean the pattern looks good to begin with, basically. So you got a nice little sort of pullback here, and when I say little, it's fairly significant, right? Because I mean it did go from 30 to 20, 31 to 21, same thing. But now you're like, as of right now today, I'm just mark this up right here just because it's a really nice little pattern that I noticed, and it's clearing the resistance from the past few days as we speak here. Now, of course, today this thing is up. Let me see. Look at my real time. Yeah, it's up almost 8%. It's up around 8% this morning. Um, but anyway, got a nice little, and then of course, a stop would just go right down there under the lows. Let me mark that. So there's some potential. A lot of these, I mean, it's difficult to, you got to stock. If you cut all this off, if you literally cut all that off, it would look more reasonable. That was just be interesting to go back and see what that was all about, because that was some real craziness there. But regardless, the current little pattern looks pretty good here. Decent risk reward, if you ask me. And I'm just throwing this out here off the top of my head. This is not one of the system picks, and it's probably due to the percentage that it's off of the high, right? So I'm not sure exactly what the what the well, here's the thing is like on the stocks that the system's going to pick, it's not going to choose a stock that's down, 80% or whatever from its recent high. That's too deep of a pullback, and it's using the actual numbers. So I'm just playing around here with and the idea was ACB, same sort of thing. Let's see, there's a couple of ETFs. MJ. Hmm, interesting. MJ's got that same pattern. It basically has the same pattern, so this looks pretty good here. And there's a POTX. So if you were ever thinking about speculating in these pot stocks, I got to tell you, these they all look really good right here with a stop at the recent low. I mean, that's the whole thing. So these are pretty good setups, quite honestly. Just sort of pulling them out of pulling them out of thin air this morning only because I noticed, I hadn't really looked at them, but and hey, everybody knows that New York is getting ready to legalize it, but they just look like pretty good charts to me. All right, not a whole lot of risk in these things, to tell you the truth. So if you were looking for something, I know there's only a couple open trades and only a handful of of pending trades right now. I kind of expect that. I expect that to change a little bit because part of the reason that there's not a whole lot of pending trades is because like a lot of the stocks that have been hammered um, haven't really like sort of bottomed out and started to turn up yet. Like today could be, one of the first days that some of these stocks are starting to come back up. So anyway, we've had MOH open for a long time now, right? And we'll look at that chart here in a second. And then ExxonMobil has triggered here recently on its pullback. So let's take a look at those. MOH, funny thing about MOH is that and we went over all the wiggles on the chart and all this stuff last week on the show here. So I'd say the system did a pretty good job of managing the trailing stop on this particular stock. And as we sit here right now, this trailing stop at 229 is basically, been in place for a while. It's basically probably going to coast right here um, with this stop at 229 until it can sort of break out of this. And you can see the target right here. So this is where it got opened back here. This is this is the target up here, and you can see that it's just been hanging around there for. I mean, it's practically been closing within a few points of the target for a couple of weeks now. So it's going to need to move up here away from all this congestion in order for this to come up. But so far so good, considering that it's been, well, geez, when was this? February 12th. So we're talking a month and a half, right? Still looking pretty good. So, and then of course the everyone remembers good old ExxonMobil because of this trade here that was another like month and a half type of thing. So, it's the old adage, let your winners run, cut your losers short. So that's basically, what this cycle has been all about. And we had some stop outs, last week, I guess it was, on some of those days. But, slowly but surely we'll get a pending list that builds up and a bunch of them trigger in. So I don't know what to think about ExxonMobil and energy here. Was a decent pullback. I mean, it was a decent little setup there, right? So conceptually, what the system is doing here is basically the same thing that happened back over here. You got run up, nice pullback, and then the pullback sort of resumes, right? Trailing stop follows it up, and you can see how tight it got up here at the top. Um, and then so, we've had another decent pullback. These 2 days are kind of interesting. They kind of, you know, these 2 days, these green bars here that were both like lower, they kind of cemented a low theoretically. I mean, unless obviously, but that just seems like it's kind of like the one we were just looking at there. I mean, a lot of times you can see a chart and you can say, okay, it's worth a shot, and it's a very well-defined point for a stop. So, and of course, it sort of triggered in. What's crazy is how gappy this is for. Seems gappy anyway, and kind of erratic on a day-to-day basis, considering it's ExxonMobil. So I usually, something like this, I don't really get too worked up about the fact that it basically it triggered in right at day on Monday, right at the trigger price. The trigger price of 57.50 here actually opened a little bit lower and pushed up to it. So it's always nice to have it trigger at the exact trigger price. Yeah, it's a little bit of a pullback here, no big deal. I mean, unless it's planning on rolling over and breaking back below these lows, but very well defined risk here. Um, Super big cap stock, not extremely speculative, right? And so it's not going to be like one of these internet stocks or a Chinese internet stock or something. Oh, speaking of that, this whole Viacom thing, this is insane. I mean, see, Viacom CBS is not like, some Chinese internet stock, right? And so I'm sure you guys saw the story of some big hedge fund guy that blew up or whatever and holding a bunch of these stocks. This is just a testament to the overall risk in the market that a stock like this could basically blow up in a matter of time, go from 100 to 40 something. But then again, you wonder if like that same guy didn't basically cause this that caused this, right? So I mean, this is kind of here's a good example. Stock doubles and then loses half its value, but this is just absolutely incredible how that sort of turned out. So anyway, yeah, so not a whole lot. I mean, we got the two open trades right now, and then we've got some on deck. The pending list here. Let's take a look at the pending list. I'll go through that, and then basically we're kind of waiting for more stocks to start hitting this pending list here. And they will too, especially now that we're getting a little bit of a rally here today in some of the beat down names. I expect to see some of these pending stocks hit the list. So let's look at them here. RVLV, Revolve Group. That's a pretty good looking chart. Oh, look, we had a trade in it way back here. Huh, interesting. Nice uptrend. A little bit of wackiness right here. That could have very well been earnings. New highs, and then a nice little pullback and pivot low yesterday. Interesting. There's a pretty nice little pivot low there yesterday, tell you the truth. So, and then of course, right now, it's pushing up against like these highs right here. So let's see. Trigger's a little bit higher. Trigger's a little bit above all of these highs from the past few days here. So this is actually a pretty good candidate for a bounce back. So now it has moved. It's got an 8.2% average range, as you can see over here. Can you see that on the screen? Yeah, average range. So this is something interesting to look at with the pending list here is the volatility. Something to consider, especially when the list starts to get really big. It gives you like sort of an idea what to expect, right? So, ExxonMobil, something like that. Some of these really big cap, thick stocks they call them, I guess. Yeah, you'd have a 2-3% average range, something like this. When you see, and there was another one there with the 8% average range, so you just expect, bigger moves and more volatility. So you're out on the risk curve a little bit. So, anyways, this one's looking pretty good, quite frankly. I always say ideally. So we don't live in an ideal world, and so sometimes you get a stock like this over the next today. I mean, this thing could like literally trigger in, or it could bounce around between yesterday's low and where it is now for a period of time. And so what I was just about to say is, ideally it would spend some time consolidating, in this box and then break out. And quite frankly, I mean, if it pulled back towards, yesterday's midpoint or low and consolidate a little bit more, this trigger could easily come down a little bit. But, time would have to go by. You'd probably have to have four or 5 days of lower price action in order for this trigger to move down. So, but as of right now, I mean, this you see this all the time. You get kind of sell off like this and then just a snap back right back up to, right back up here to kind of the top of this bar. So not bad. Quite frankly, it's not a bad looking setup. Now this next one, this JO, this could theoretically drop off the list here anytime based on today's price action. I never have liked this thing. It's really sort of thin, and for whatever reason, the system itself is like, this is one of the candidates. It's basically the coffee, ETN, but really thin volume. It's pretty erratic. I mean, if you catch it on an upswing or whatever, it can obviously you can see on the chart here, but there's also a lot of whipsawing that occurs here, and basically this thing was on the list, and then these past 2 days, well, it hasn't dropped off yet. Yesterday wasn't really enough of a sell-off to cause it to drop off the list, but boy, it's getting close, right? You can see this low back here, from right there, and so now that it's broken below that, you know, it's probably really close to being gone. I don't like the thing. The very last alert we got in it basically got stopped out, and so that always and plus it's just so thin, right? So at least with all these other commodities rising, at least the price of coffee, the commodity itself doesn't look like it's headed higher. So I just assume this thing drops off the list so they don't raise the price of coffee everywhere too. All right, so let's look at PayPal. PayPal looking pretty good here. Now I drew some lines on here last week, and interestingly enough, let's see, when was last Wednesday was sort of this ended up being this long range day down. So this has got a fairly decent look to it, quite honestly. You had this really steep sell off, and then a bounce, right? And then sold back down, made a higher low. So I don't like to have too much junk on my charts, but that little higher low right there is a little bit of a positive sign, positive divergence, I suppose, if you put a bunch of indicators on here. And so, there it is. Basically, starting to look pretty good, starting to set up. And so, yeah, that looks reasonable. This particular charting platform, well, that actually looks pretty good. But so there you go. I mean, in one way, it looks like a Head and Shoulders, right? So let me change this to red. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a Head and Shoulders looking type of thing here, but there's a bunch of support. But anyway, yeah, and so it looks like it could be forming like a little W. So let's see, trigger price. The trigger price looks like it was about 250 last week, and so it's come down a little bit. So trigger price, yeah, up in this area here, kind of above that high. So yeah, so it's kind of right on the line here. If you know, and of course, PayPal is one of those, and that's one of these high flying momentum stocks. We had a good trade in it back here last fall, and so this sell off and this consolidation is looking pretty positive. And if it can get a little momentum to the upside, well then it's a pretty darn good candidate, right? So I like the look of that. That's so you know, PayPal and RVLV, even though there's not a whole lot to choose from here, those two have really good looks to them, and so those could end up being a couple of decent trades. Um, you know, and this one's looking okay too, actually. Same sort of thing. Basically, you got a low. Now this low looks like it was a little bit lower than the previous one, and so, but it is what it is, right? The cool thing about this, let me get that off there. Well, incidentally, this was a trigger price that never got triggered in. This would have been last week's trigger, right? But what's really kind of neat about this is that you got another one of these sort of orderly sell-offs right here, right? Pretty orderly little walk down type of sell-off. And as we speak today, I mean yesterday, yesterday morning this thing was looking nasty because it was below these lows and it had sold down and all that. But you can kind of see where it's seems like it's finding a little bit of support here. And so interestingly enough, the trigger is still a ways away. Let me get rid of this. So it's got a little bit of work to do, right? In theory you could, and a lot of setups are like this. Theoretically, you could buy this here and put a stop at yesterday's low, and that might work. But the system itself it's still kind of hanging back and waiting for the confirmation. And so the simple fact that we just sold back down to the area of the previous lows means that it's being a little more. It's waiting for some real confirmation. Now, of course, depending on what happens in the next few days, this could move, right? This could move back down. And this is another one that if you come over here and look at the average range, you can sort these too, by the way. So if there's ever like a dozen stocks on here, you can sort that by the column header. But so anyways, yeah, this one's looking okay too. So basically, there's three really good potential setups here, and I expect more to start hitting anytime now because we're starting to see these bounces off of recent lows in some of the high flyers, right? Some of them, and so that's basically what it takes. Like it's not gonna it's gonna wait until the momentum sort of shifts back up, and then they're gonna hit the list. So I expect to see the list grow, and I'd avoid that JO. I would pretend it's not even there, and it wouldn't surprise me to see that drop off the list tonight. And so we'll see what happens with that. But anyway, so far so good. Um, with the open trades and the ones that are pending. And so, of course, we got the rest of today's session. S&P's up a little bit, 18 points, but we're literally like one or two decent rally days away from S&P 4,000, which is pretty amazing, right? I mean, it's so close. It's like which would equate to SPY 400, which is a huge milestone. I mean, that's a massive milestone considering, um, it was in the low 2000s at the pandemic lows, and so I mean that was literally like practically a double, not quite, but absolutely amazing. So anyway, keep your eye on everything, and It's kind of tomorrow maybe actually a dull day because with the market closed on Friday and Easter weekend and all that, people are making plans to do stuff. A lot of places are closed on Friday, so anyhow, long as this trend persists, S&P looks good. Q's got, they have some work to do, but they're trying anyway, and so it's going to be interesting to see, the reaction to Biden's stimulus bill, and there's just a lot going on right now. So anyway, hey, well, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it, and I will see you back here next week, same time, same place.